Picture the scene inside a wooden fort on the edge of the American frontier, in the sweltering heat of an August morning in 1812. Inside, an American general stands with a piece of chalk-white cloth in his hand, his soldiers watching him in disbelief. Outside the walls, a force smaller than his own waits in the summer haze. Men he has been told could unleash a massacre he would be powerless to stop. He has over 2,000 soldiers under his command. The enemy facing him has barely half that number. And yet, in the next few minutes, he will surrender his army, his fort, and an entire American territory without a single shot fired in its defense. How does a general with more men, more guns, and a fortified position choose to give up everything rather than fight? The answer lies not in the strength of the army outside the walls, but in the mind of the man who commanded it. A British officer who understood that a war could sometimes be won before the first cannon ever roared. To understand how this moment came to be, we first need to understand the man who engineered it, and the world that shaped him. Isaac Brock was born in October of 1769 on the island of Guernsey, a small British possession off the coast of France, the eighth son of a large and moderately wealthy family. It was, by historical coincidence, the same year that produced two of the era's other towering military figures, Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington, though Brock's path to prominence would look nothing like theirs. He joined the British Army as an ensign at just 15 years old, entering the 8th Regiment of Foot, where tradition held that the most junior officer was given responsibility for guarding the regimental colors in battle. From these modest beginnings, Brock rose steadily. He reached the rank of captain, transferred to the 49th Regiment of Foot in 1791, and by 1797, still in his 20s, had become a lieutenant colonel. Contemporaries debated whether his rapid rise owed more to fortune or to genuine skill. The historical record suggests it was a combination of both, along with a personal magnetism that made him popular among the men he led. Brock's early military service took him through several of the campaigns of the French Revolutionary Wars. He saw action during the Anglo-Russian invasion of Holland in 1799, part of a coalition effort against French-aligned forces, and he later took part in the 1801 naval expedition against Copenhagen, one of the more dramatic operations of the era, in which a British fleet under Admiral Nelson attacked the Danish capital to prevent its navy from falling into Napoleon's hands. Despite these experiences, historians generally note that Brock, across his career, saw relatively limited direct combat compared to many of his contemporaries. His defining test as a commander was still ahead of him, and it would come not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the dense forests and frontier settlements of British North America. In 1802, Brock was posted to Canada, a transfer that would define the rest of his life. The Canada he arrived in was not an easy command. He inherited a regiment plagued by desertions and simmering unrest, at one point narrowly avoiding a mutiny among his own troops. The broader colonial garrison was underfunded, poorly disciplined, and viewed with some suspicion by the civilian population it was meant to protect. Over the following decade, Brock worked patiently to reshape this force, tightening discipline, improving morale, and building a genuine rapport with the men under his command, an achievement his biographers consistently point to as central to his later success. He was promoted to colonel in 1805, and in 1811, at the rank of Major General, he assumed responsibility for both the civil administration and military defense of Upper Canada, the colony that today forms much of the province of Ontario. For a man of Brock's ambition, this posting was, by his own account, a source of frustration. His letters from this period repeatedly express a longing to serve where the real fighting was happening, in Europe, where Britain's war against Napoleon was reaching some of its most consequential stages. He described his position in Canada in one letter as being buried in this inactive remote corner of the empire, far from the glory being won by British forces on the continent. Early in 1812, word reached him that London was finally prepared to reassign him to more active service in Europe. But by then, the situation in North America had grown too dangerous for him to leave. Brock wrote back requesting to remain in his post, recognizing that a storm was gathering on the American frontier that would soon demand every ounce of the discipline and leadership he had spent a decade building. That storm arrived in June of 1812, when the United States formally declared war on Great Britain. The causes were several. American leaders and merchants had long chafed under British restrictions on transatlantic trade, imposed as part of Britain's broader economic war against Napoleon's France. Perhaps more inflammatory was the British practice of impressment, in which the Royal Navy forcibly seized sailors from American merchant ships and compelled them into service in British fleets, a practice American officials viewed as an intolerable violation of national sovereignty. There was also a widely held belief, particularly among expansionist voices in the American government, that British authorities in Canada were arming and encouraging indigenous nations to resist American settlement on the western frontier. With Britain's military attention consumed by the ongoing struggle against Napoleon, American strategists saw a rare opportunity. Canada, in their assessment, was lightly defended and poorly garrisoned, and a swift invasion might succeed where diplomacy had failed. Thomas Jefferson himself had once remarked that acquiring Canada would be, in his words, merely a matter of marching. The reality facing Brock made this American confidence understandable. The border separating British and American territory stretched for nearly 1,300 kilometers, an immense distance to defend, and Brock had at his disposal only 7 regiments of regular infantry, totaling around 4,500 troops, supplemented by a roughly equal number of colonial militia of uncertain reliability. Against this thin defensive line, the United States could field a regular army supported by state militias drawn from a population many times the size of Upper Canada's. On paper, the American invasion should have succeeded quickly and decisively. Anticipating exactly this danger, Brock had spent the months before the declaration of war quietly preparing his forces and strengthening militia readiness, even while many political leaders in both Canada and Britain still believed war might be avoided entirely. The opening American thrust into this contested frontier fell to Brigadier General William Hull, the 59-year-old governor of Michigan Territory. Hull was not a novice to warfare. Decades before, as a younger officer during the American Revolution, he had fought with distinction, taking part in engagements including the assault on Stony Point, one of the most celebrated night operations of that earlier war. But nearly 40 years separated the young officer who had charged British lines at Stony Point from the cautious, aging administrator now tasked with commanding an invasion into Canada. Hull assembled an army of regulars and Ohio militia, numbering close to 2,000 men, and marched them north toward Detroit, arriving in early July of 1812. Detroit itself occupied a position of real strategic importance. Sitting on the western edge of American territory, along the river separating Michigan from Upper Canada, it controlled access between the United States and the Great Lakes, and served as the principal American stronghold on this contested frontier. The fort protecting the settlement was a timber palisade structure, mounting artillery capable of defending against a direct assault, though military analysts of the period noted a significant weakness. It could not easily bring fire to bear against ships moving on the Detroit River, nor against artillery positioned on the opposite riverbank, a vulnerability that would later prove consequential. Shortly after arriving, Hull crossed the Detroit River into Canadian territory near the settlement of Sandwich, occupying it without resistance on July 12th. 8 days later, he issued a bold proclamation addressed to the Canadian population, calling on them to throw off what he characterized as British oppression and embrace the liberty offered by the United States. It was a confident opening gesture from a general who, at that stage, still believed the campaign would unfold in his favor. It would also prove to be one of the last confident decisions William Hull made during this campaign. Detroit itself sat at a critical position on the western frontier, and its capture or loss would carry consequences far beyond the town itself. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, consider subscribing so you don't miss how a numerically superior force found itself surrendering without resistance. And let us know in the comments what you would have done in Hull's position, faced with an enemy of unknown strength gathering outside your walls. As Hull's campaign progressed, his position began to deteriorate in ways he had not anticipated. British and Allied indigenous forces moved to sever his supply lines running south through Ohio, cutting off the flow of provisions and reinforcements his army depended on. His reconnaissance had suggested that the British post at Amherstburg, further down the river, was only weakly defended, and for a time, an assault against it seemed plausible. But before Hull could commit to any decisive action, unsettling news reached his camp. Fort Mackinac, a remote American outpost far to the north, had fallen to a combined British and indigenous force without any resistance at all. Its garrison caught entirely unaware that war had even been declared. The psychological effect of this news on Hull's army, and on Hull himself, was significant. His earlier confidence began to give way to a mounting anxiety, and he ordered his forces to withdraw back across the river into the relative safety of Fort Detroit. It was into this unraveling situation that Major General Isaac Brock entered the campaign in person. Upon learning of the crisis developing on the Detroit frontier, Brock acted with the same decisiveness that had defined his decade of preparation in Canada. He gathered a mixed force of British regulars, colonial militia, and indigenous allies, and marched them west toward Fort Amherstburg, arriving there on August 13th with an additional 300 men to reinforce the garrison already stationed nearby. When his full force was assembled, Brock commanded roughly 1,300 fighters in total, a corps of British regular soldiers, several hundred Canadian militia, and approximately 600 indigenous warriors under the leadership of the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, one of the most capable and influential indigenous military leaders of his generation. Facing this combined force inside Detroit was an American garrison of more than 2,000 men, well supplied and fortified behind timber walls. By any conventional military calculation, launching an assault against a larger entrenched enemy was an extraordinary gamble, the kind of decision that could just as easily end in catastrophic defeat as in victory. Against the advice of nearly every senior officer under his command, Brock chose to attack anyway. Colonel Henry Proctor and the majority of his staff urged caution, arguing that the numerical disadvantage made a direct assault reckless. Only two officers, John McDonnell and Robert Nichol, supported Brock's determination to move forward. When Tecumseh learned that Brock intended to strike despite being outnumbered, he is reported to have said of him, "This is a man." Historians note that this specific quotation, like many attributed to figures of this period, cannot be verified with complete certainty, but the broader historical record is consistent in describing a genuine mutual respect that developed rapidly between the two commanders during their brief time working together, a respect built on shared boldness and a mutual understanding of how to unsettle a hesitant enemy. Brock's plan for taking Detroit did not rest primarily on brute force. It rested on his understanding of psychology, and specifically, on his read of William Hull's state of mind. Brock recognized that his opponent was already unsettled by the fall of Fort Mackinac, already isolated by the loss of his supply lines, and already burdened by fear of what a battle involving indigenous warriors might mean for the civilians sheltering inside his fort. Rather than relying solely on the uncertain outcome of a frontal assault, Brock designed a campaign built around perception, aiming to convince Hull that his situation was more desperate than it actually was. Before committing to any attack, Brock sent Hull a formal written demand for the surrender of Detroit. In it, he warned that once the fighting began, the large force of indigenous warriors allied with the British would be, in his own words, beyond my control, a deliberately calculated threat aimed squarely at Hull's deepest anxiety. Hull refused the demand. In response, the British artillery positioned across the river at Sandwich opened fire on the American fort, and Hull's own 24-pounder guns returned the exchange. This initial bombardment was significant less for the physical damage it inflicted on the fort's walls than for the psychological pressure it placed on the men and the commander sheltering behind them. That night, under cover of darkness, Brock authorized his combined force, including a substantial contingent of Tecumseh's warriors, to begin crossing the Detroit River toward American soil. To exaggerate the apparent size of his army, Brock had his limited number of regular troops parade repeatedly across open ground within view of the fort's defenders, marching the same soldiers past the same vantage points multiple times so that American lookouts would report a force far larger than what truly existed. Meanwhile, Tecumseh's warriors moved through gaps in the surrounding forest clearly visible from inside the fort, letting out sustained war cries intended to reach the ears of the soldiers and civilians trapped within its walls. Every element of this display, from the staged troop movements to the deliberate noise, was constructed for a single purpose: to convince William Hull that any attempt at resistance would end in disaster. We're at the point in this story where the outcome truly hangs in the balance, and it's worth pausing here. If you're enjoying how deception and nerve shaped this campaign as much as any weapon did, tap that like button and tell us in the comments whether you think Hull's fear was justified or whether Detroit could have held against Brock's smaller force. Conditions inside the fort, meanwhile, were deteriorating in ways that went beyond pure military calculation. Detroit was not occupied by soldiers alone. Its walls sheltered women, children, and elderly residents of the surrounding town who had sought protection within the fortification. And several historical accounts indicate that members of Hull's own family were present among them. During the bombardment, a shell exploded within the fort's grounds, inflicting casualties among those sheltering inside and driving home, in the most visceral way possible. The danger that continued resistance might pose to civilians, as well as soldiers. For a commander already destabilized by the loss of Mackinac, the severing of his supply lines, and Brock's explicit warning about the limits of his control over his indigenous allies, this combination of pressures appears to have proven decisive. On the morning of August the 16th, as Brock's forces made their final preparations to launch an assault on the fort, William Hull reached his breaking point, overruling the objections of several of his own subordinate officers, many of whom still believed the position was defensible given their numerical advantage. Hull ordered a white flag raised over Fort Detroit. What followed was not a negotiated partial withdrawal, but a complete and unconditional surrender. Hull handed over the fort itself, the town of Detroit, the entirety of Michigan Territory, and his full army of more than 2,000 men, all without a single shot exchange in the fort's actual defense. British losses across the entire campaign totaled only a handful of men. American losses, measured in captured personnel, numbered in the thousands, along with dozens of cannon and several vessels that fell into British hands. The consequences of this surrender rippled outward almost immediately, and in every direction. For Brock, the victory was an extraordinary vindication of a decision that had defied nearly all conventional military wisdom, a triumph achieved through nerve and calculated deception against an enemy who, on paper, should have prevailed. News of the capture spread quickly through Upper Canada, transforming what had been a population gripped by pessimism and vulnerable to pro-American sentiment into one newly energized in its willingness to defend the colony. Brock himself emerged from the campaign with a reputation that would soon earn him a knighthood and induction into the Order of the Bath, along with a nickname that has followed him through Canadian history ever since, the hero of Upper Canada, and to many, simply the man who saved Canada. Tecumseh's Confederacy, meanwhile, gained enormous credibility among indigenous nations watching the outcome unfold, strengthening resistance efforts against American expansion across the broader frontier in the months that followed. For William Hull, the consequences were personal, immediate, and severe. News of the surrender reached the American public with disbelief, followed swiftly by outrage and humiliation. For the first time since the Revolutionary War, British forces now occupied American territory, an outcome that struck many Americans as an almost unthinkable reversal. Hull himself would face the full weight of that outrage. He was court-martialed on charges including cowardice and neglect of duty, and a military tribunal sentenced him to death. In recognition of his earlier service during the Revolution decades before, President James Madison ultimately remitted the sentence, sparing Hull's life, though not his reputation, which never recovered. Most of the surrendered militiamen were released under parole and allowed to return to their homes along the frontier, while the regular army troops taken at Detroit were transported as prisoners into Canada. Historians examining this campaign today tend to emphasize a particular lesson embedded within it, one that distinguishes the fall of Detroit from many other engagements of the period. This was not primarily a story of overwhelming force, triumphing over a weaker opponent. In terms of raw numbers, the opposite was true. Brock's combined force of regulars, militia, and indigenous warriors was smaller than the American garrison it faced, and by any traditional measure of military strength, Hull's position inside a fortified structure with superior numbers should have favored the defenders. What decided the outcome instead was Brock's precise understanding of his opponent's psychology. his willingness to accept enormous personal and strategic risk against the counsel of his own senior officers, and his skillful use of deception, staged troop movements, and calculated threats to make his force appear far more formidable than it actually was. The fall of Fort Detroit remains, more than 2 centuries later, one of the most studied examples in early 19th century military history of a battle effectively won before it began. It stands as a reminder that fortifications, artillery, and superior numbers, however imposing on paper, ultimately depend on the resolve of the men commanding them. Isaac Brock understood that a fortress can fall not because its walls are breached, but because the mind defending them has already surrendered. In the tense, uncertain hours along the Detroit River in August of 1812, it was that understanding, more than any cannon or musket, that decided the fate of an entire American army.